Cruise ships are supposed to be happy, luxurious, and a place to escape. But what if I told you that there's something much worse lying behind the laughter, the music, and the ocean breeze? These tales are factual, verified, chilling, and unforgettable. They originate from actual occurrences and are rechecked from personal accounts and communities like Reddit. You'll hear 5 of the scariest cruise ship horror stories ever recounted tonight, each one drawing you farther into the sea's shadows. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready. Untold Happenings is this, because once you hop on board, there might not be a way back. Don't forget to subscribe, click the bell button, and leave a comment with your opinions. Story 1. The atrium lights hummed with a nervous, mechanical patience, and the ship smelled of salt and old coffee. I briefly believed that the entire ship was holding its breath, as though it were anticipating something that only it could perceive. Ethan R. Mallory is my name. I'm 34 years old and employed in Providence, Rhode Island as an assistant archivist. When I tell people what I do for a living, they chuckle because it sounds like a fancy way of stating that I spend my days filing boxes. But it worked for me. As someone who pays attention to handwriting, footnotes, and the strange gaps in documents that no one else does, I've always been cautious. I booked this cruise in part for that reason. After a brief illness, my sister Sarah passed away last winter, and sadness crept into every inch of my residence. I hoped a week at sea would help me regain my breath. I wanted peace and quiet, a horizon free from distractions, not a party or adventure. I thought the Ocean Valiant was too well trained and polished when I first stepped on board. Smiles as fixed as photos, crew uniforms without a crease. On deck 7, I got a stateroom with a heavy sliding door that shook when the engines pulsed and a little balcony. I recall looking at the life preserver on the interior wall for longer than I should have, because it was brilliant orange against the beige. Almost instantly, the first abnormality appeared. The loudspeakers crackled with the standard instructions as we drove out of port, but the captain's statement cut off in the middle of a phrase, causing an abrupt glitch. Silence a moment later, no repeat, no apology. Something about the sudden slash stuck in my chest, even though everyone else shrugged it off. A child's single shoe was left on a lounge chair by the pool when I later investigated the ship. The laces were stiff from salt, and the leather was broken from the sun. It didn't appear to be claimed. Even when I pointed, crew members continued to walk past it as if it didn't exist. I was looking at a man at the corner table in the dining hall that night. He had brown complexion, thinning hair, and radar-scanning eyes. His eyes didn't match the tiny smile he had on his face as he whispered, almost too low to hear, "Keep your door on the chain." It seemed like advice wrapped in a joke. I discovered a typewritten note tucked beneath the door of my cabin. White paper, plain. "Remember the light," 4 words in bold, no explanation, no signature. Before sliding under, the paper felt strangely chilly, as if it had been placed in a freezer. I reminded myself not to ponder too much. People lose their shoes. The speakers aren't working properly. The note might have been a joke. However, on my way to breakfast the following morning, I came upon a maintenance bulletin pinned close to the stairwell. It included safety checks and repair schedules in blocky print, all of which were dated June 14th. However, it was August. I questioned a steward about it, and he gave me a short smirk, called it a misprint, and then tore it down before I could take another look. I thought, little things. Omens are created out of nothing by grief. Nevertheless, I began jotting down dates, times, and pieces in a small notebook. The instinct of an archivist. The casino was humming with laughing that night in the passageways, but the air was quiet when I got off the elevator on my level. A piece of paper had been attached to the cabin across from mine, but the ink had been scraped off until just grooves were left. 3 slow taps on my door later that night while I sat in bed with the TV muttering for company. Measured, not urgent. Similar to a pulse. I listened and froze. On the other hand, knock knock. Through the peephole, I peered. The hallway was deserted. Just the quiet of a space that seemed larger than it should have been. and the dim glimmer of the emergency light. I stayed up until the sun came up and chained the lock. The ship continued to offer karaoke, shuffleboard competitions, forced cheer, and unending banquets. But the feeling that I was being watched persisted. A lifeguard shrugged, murmured something about misplaced property, and hurried off when I queried him about the sneaker that was still resting close to the pool. At that moment, I discovered the black and white portrait of a family standing on a deck, the kind of faded attic photo, hidden beneath the tile along the water's edge. "Don't let it out," is written in shaky handwriting across the bottom. The ink appeared new. The lifeguard wouldn't get near it, as though my eyes were the only ones that could see it. Other passengers passed by it without noticing. I put the snapshot in my pocket. The ship's engine rumbled so loudly that night that I could feel it in my teeth. In my dream, I saw a face looking through the balcony glass, doors that opened to black water, and hallways that looped back on themselves till I eventually fell asleep. My door's chain was unlatched when I woke up. I gazed at the dangling chain as though it may suddenly move again, my chest constricted. Before I went to sleep, I knew I had latched it. The chain required deliberate lifting, angling, and pushing in order to come loose. Even as the idea was developing, I didn't believe it, even if I told myself that perhaps I had done it half-heartedly. That morning, the hallways outdoors felt strange. Sure, it's brighter but too quiet. Since the most of the people were still eating breakfast, I decided to explore beyond the souvenir stands and the framed Caribbean maps. I saw a service door that was slightly open. It had a slight diesel and lemon disinfectant odor. A tiny maintenance tunnel with exposed pipes, hissing, and a strip of fluorescent lamps buzzing erratically extended inside. Archivist instinct triumphed over prudence. I took over. A black marker line wound like a crude map along the floor halfway down the passageway. I continued till a thick gray door marked the end of the hall. A paper tag with the words "Maintenance, Do Not Enter" dangled from the handle. It was normal enough, but someone had written "Remember the Light" in pen over it. The words repeated what I had already seen, and my hands briefly shook. Before anyone could catch me, I retreated and reintegrated into the passenger crowd. A woman in her 50s leaned on the railing next to me later that day on deck. She muttered that her husband had gone out for a smoke during the night and never returned, and she appeared scared. The crew informed her that he had most likely been inebriated, wandered, and possibly even slipped overboard. They asked her to remain composed and gave her spa vouchers. In her hand, she held a pack of cigarettes so tightly that the cardboard crumpled. I wished it had been an accident. It is true that people fall from ships. Her red, agitated, and sleep-deprived eyes, however, brought to mind the note beneath my door. I heard some music that evening, childlike, faint. At 3 in the morning, a lullaby as thin as air drifted down the stairway outside my cabin. There were no footsteps, no lights, and the kids' club was closed. I pressed my ear on the metal wall while standing barefoot in the hallway. After a brief period of swirling, the music ceased in the middle of a note. By this point, I was always carrying my notebook with me, recording phrases, timings, and bits like proof. Passing crew would give it a short glimpse before immediately averting their eyes, as if they were worried that by noticing it might implicate them. The tan man who had forewarned me about the chain had left at breakfast. His napkin was folded with uncanny accuracy, and his seat was empty. The server plainly said, "Sir, you checked out early when I asked." Checked out? Midway over the ocean. I made myself do the typical activities for the remainder of the day, like playing trivia, watching a movie by the pool, and playing shuffleboard. However, every chuckle and glass clinking felt practiced, as if the entire ship were behaving in its own right. I didn't realize I'd said out loud until I said, "If you're listening, take a second to subscribe to Untold Happenings. It helps keep stories like this alive." I laughed nervously at myself, but the absurdity was the only thing preventing panic. Later that night, I discovered another note. "Don't go to AFT," slipped under my door. All night long I held the message tightly. I made the decision to exert more effort the next morning. I went back to the service corridor that I had discovered before. This time, the marker line led around a corner I hadn't previously observed rather than to the do not enter door. This place had weak fluorescent lights, some of which flickered so much that the walls appeared to be breathing. There was another hatch at the end, tiny, spherical, and damaged from years of handling. Something deeper than engines, almost like chanting, filtered through it in a faint murmur. I squeezed my ear shut. The sound changed and took on a rhythm, resembling the coordinated stomping of dozens of feet. Then there was quiet. I opened my eyes to find lettering gouged by a sharp object and scratches on the paint. Deliberate, but not deep enough to read well. A caution had also been attempted to be written here. I swiftly turned away. On a bench beside the wash, back upstairs, I discovered a folded towel. A tiny note with the words "He won't wake," scrawled in shaky handwriting, was concealed inside, seemingly waiting for me. To keep it out of sight, I shoved it into my pocket. The towel was gone by the time I got back. Over the loudspeakers that evening, the captain informed, in a steady voice, that we would be hosting a silent memorial for a passenger who had tragically lost their life. He offered condolences. No name though, no specifics. Furthermore, the phrase "lost their life" seemed like a veil covering something more repulsive. The passengers whispered. Some of them wept in private. Most simply made their way back to the buffet line. The wind pulled at my jacket as I walked the outer deck as the sun began to set. The horizon gleamed red in the distance. A deck chair with a magazine left on it caught my attention. There found another Polaroid inside, sandwiched between glossy advertisements. The face of a woman was carved out, her features brutally hidden. "The cabin changes" is written in ink on the bottom. The magazine was gone by the time I looked up. The wind was all that was left, wrapped in towels and concealed in pamphlets. The Ocean Valiant appeared to be carrying its secrets like illegal goods, and I was starting to believe that those secrets were only for me. Sleep had turned into an enemy by the third night. I listened to the continuous hum of the engines below as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered whether the sound was drowning out other sounds, gentler human sounds. The faint scrape of metal woke me up at about 3 in the morning. I initially assumed it was coming from my balcony, but when I got closer, I noticed that the glass was foggy with moisture, as if someone had been breathing on it. I stood motionless, staring out at the black expanse of the water, until I noticed movement in the mirror. When I spun, a shadow that had been darting behind me disappeared. My heart struck my ribs hard. The door was unaltered, but the chain was secured. However, I was aware that I wasn't by myself in that room. The next morning, there was a lot of discussion in the hallways about the missing passenger. A young woman in her early 20s had never come back from her trip to the bar with pals. She might have disembarked at the last port, security said in a composed, practiced remark. We were days away from the next destination, but we are looking into it. Like fog, the explanation hovered in the air. Passengers looked at the staff, who walked quickly past them, and muttered in groups. What worried me the most, though, was how several crew members completely avoided making eye contact, as though simply addressing our inquiries would violate some unwritten norm. I took refuge at the library that afternoon. It was hardly used, atlases with tattered spines, half-read novels, and rows of travel guides. I discovered a maintenance log sandwiched between 2 books. The pages had a mildew odor, and there was an entry that made me shiver. Written in pen on one line, 19. The transfer has begun. No signature, no justification, only those words. I tucked the folded page into my notepad. The same widow who had lost her husband a few nights before was seated by the window when I departed. She had stopped weeping. She was doing absolutely nothing. She appeared to have accepted something inevitable as she simply folded her hands neatly in her lap and stared off into the distance. The ship had a grand supper that night. Chandeliers and waiters bearing trays of wine glasses glistened in the dining hall. Light jazz, upbeat, yet hollow, was played. The tan man who had forewarned me about the chain was nowhere to be seen among the tables, and his seat was empty, unoccupied since the first night. Rather, a different traveler was sitting there now, grinning as though he had always been there. The lights flickered in the middle of the meal. Only once, but enough to silence everyone. I looked at my bread plate and froze as they steadied again. A tiny white tag lay nicely on top of the napkin. My name had been written in black ink on it. Nobody sat near enough for me to notice that they had put it there. I excused myself after slipping the tag into my pocket. After dinner, the air felt thick, as though the walls were perspiring, and the hallways were heavier. Perhaps I was careless, but I remembered the advice. Don't go to a AT, and proceeded down the walkway toward the stern. Perhaps I was frantic to show that I wasn't dreaming. I observed fewer passengers the farther I walked. The gala's music melted into muted echoes. Ahead, a door that I had never seen before was open a little. A short stairwell led down inside. The first thing I smelled was diesel, salt, and a sweet fragrance that made me think of burned plastic. Slowly, with every step groaning beneath me, I went down. There was a refrigerated hold at the bottom. My breath hung in clouds as the frost clung to the walls. The area was bordered with high-stacked crates that were all dated 1999-2003. One lid had a name painted on it. Not a product or cargo when I brushed ice off of it, the name of an individual. I felt shivers down my back. I compared after opening the notepad. One of the passengers that went missing had the same name. I heard a faint music in the silence. The faint tune of a music box is coming to an end. I followed the sound and discovered a tiny brass toy on a crate. I touched it with my hand. The music abruptly stopped. Something moved behind me. I turned to see a little childlike shadow flicker against the frosted wall. But there was nobody there. My throat became parched, heart racing, my ears full of my own breath. I staggered back up the steps. A member of the crew was waiting when I rushed into the hallway upstairs. He had a composed, practiced look. With a gentle touch on my shoulder, he added, "You shouldn't be down there." He held on tight, almost like a parent. "Why?" I made a demand. He gave a small smile. He released his grip, turned and left, saying, "Because the ship remembers." His footsteps reverberated until they were lost in the roar of the engine. I placed a chair against the door and fastened the chain that night. I listened to every hum, every squeak, and every slight knock while I was awake. Sometime, right before sunrise, I fell asleep and awoke to the startling sound of a camera shutter. The room was empty when I opened my eyes. However, there was a shiny Polaroid on the bedside table. I was shown dozing off in my bed. In my palms, the Polaroid shook. Eyes closed, lips slightly wide. The chain on the door obviously fastened. My face peered back. The person who had taken it had been standing just here. The cold pricked my skin. I yanked back the drapes and opened drawers as I looked around the room. Nothing. The carpet has no footprints on it. No indication of anybody else's presence. Just the picture, which is still wet from developing. I promptly put it in my notebook and got dressed. Even though I didn't want to hear the answers, I needed them. With a steel drum band clattering on deck and cruise personnel promoting bingo games, the hallways that morning were alive with artificial cheer. The passengers, however, appeared different now. Apprehensive, reserved, with eyes darting to the darkness. I insisted on talking to the captain at the front desk. The clerk folded his hands and grinned blandly. "Now, sir, the captain is not available." "Then explain to me why passengers are going missing." She smiled without faltering. "Tell me why someone was in my room last night." "Maybe you've overindulged, sir. At sea, it's typical." I leaned in. "Disorientation, vivid dreams. What about the notes? The picture?" Her expression shifted for the first time. A fraction, she tensed her eyes. "You've already been noted," she remarked, lowering her voice. Before I could inquire what that meant, a second staff person showed up and steered her away. "Don't make it harder on yourself." In a trance, I roamed. The ship's joyous announcement seemed more menacing, and it felt smaller. The PA erupted in a quiz game, but halfway through the questions turned to static. At the bar, a man dropped his drink and gave me a wide-eyed, panicked face before being whisked away by staff. By nightfall, I compelled myself to return to the aft passageways. They were there if the ship had secrets. with a new seal on it. The hatch to the refrigerated hold was now locked. However, a slight breeze of cold continued to permeate the margins. Another tag was lying next to the hatch. This one only had a number on it, instead of my name. 314. The number of my cabin. I stumbled back to my chamber. Another Polaroid was waiting patiently on the pillow of the bed. This one featured me standing in the hallway, looking at the hatch I had just left. Notebook in hand. I ran. The horizon was streaked with bruised crimson as the sun sank, and I was on the upper deck. Once more, the woman who had lost her husband was standing close to the railing. Her mouth twitched as though she was praying, but she made no sound. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of me. "They keep us cataloged," she said. "We are just that. Records." "You mean what?" I made a demand. Her voice broke. "You've already been filed when your tag appears." She turned aside, her shoulders trembling, and entered the passenger line. I was having trouble breathing, with dates, names, and bits that suddenly resembled the ledger of an unintelligible library more than evidence. My notepad felt heavier than before. I blocked the door once more that night, yet sleep still came and swept me down like a flood. There were footsteps in my cabin as I woke up. I didn't breathe. Over me, a shadow leaned. Something was forced into my chest by a hand that suddenly pulled away. The smell of old paper and salt filled the air. I turned the lamp on. There was nobody. Another tag was on my chest, glossy white and printed in the same tidy font. My name and number weren't on it this time. 2 words: transfer complete. My throat tightened in panic. I opened the balcony door and inhaled the chilly air. The sea was limitless and black, and behind me, in the glass's reflection, was a fuzzy figure with eyes like drowned stars instead of my own shape. I whirled. Nothing. An announcement crackled overhead the following morning. Calm. Practiced. Final. The observation is over. We appreciate your cooperation. The passengers continued eating breakfast, laughing and chatting. However, no one was observing me as I looked around. No one looked in my direction. The mirror over the sink in my cabin was foggy, like if someone had breathed on it. My notebook was on the desk, pages flapping, but no window was open. Slowly, letters appeared in the condensation, etched by an invisible hand. Remember the light. The Polaroids scattered across the carpet after slipping free. Among them was one that I had never seen or taken. It displayed the ship's hold, which was made up of high-stacked rows of containers. My entire name was inscribed in black characters on the nearest crate. I blinked, feeling sick to my stomach. I checked again, but the picture was gone. There was nothing left save the empty carpet. However, I am convinced that a crate is waiting for me someplace, deep under the ocean valiant's frigid belly. Furthermore, I'm not sure if I've been put inside it already. Story 2. Luxury. Adventure and the excitement of the wide sea were all promised by the cruise ship. It was meant to be a week away from her hectic professional life in New York, however, and a vacation for Sophia Klein. In the hopes of peaceful evenings and views of the ocean, she had reserved a solitary stateroom on Deck 7. She was surprised to see someone standing just outside the balcony door. Despite the thermostat reading 72, she felt an odd coldness as soon as she entered her cabin. Here, the weight of invisible eyes seemed to be weighing down the air. She dismissed it and proceeded to unpack her bag, attempting to persuade herself that it was only pre-vacation anxiety. Subtle changes started after the second night. There was a faint, very undetectable humming in the hallway. Sophia stopped and listened carefully, but as soon as she approached the door, the sound vanished. Despite her gut telling her otherwise, she blamed it on the ship's equipment. Then the first arrived. For a brief moment, the shadow behind her was visible in the reflection in the cabin mirror. It disappeared every time she looked, leaving just the typical reflection of her own tight face. She tried to shrug it off, telling herself that travel and stress might deceive the mind and that she was tired. However, the cabin appeared to react to her motions. Her bag inexplicably moved during the night, and the lights flickered randomly. When she woke up one morning, it was open and her clothing were folded perfectly, but not by her. She was unable to escape the growing uneasiness. On the third night, the actual tension increased. Outside her cabin, Sophia heard slow, methodical footsteps pacing. The corridor was empty as she opened the door, but there was a slight odor of salt water and something metallic in the air. Her heartbeat accelerated. This was no typical cruise. She noticed a tall, slender person standing motionless in a corner of the hallway, head cocked as if watching her every step. It vanished the instant she blinked. "You don't belong here." A voice that was barely audible followed, blending interest and fear. Sophia was aware that she needed to record the events. In an attempt to get evidence of the paranormal presence, she set her phone to record all night. By daybreak, her video showed objects changing slightly in unthinkable ways and fuzzy forms moving through the cabin. This cruise ship, she thought, had secrets. Shadows of former guests, memories confined within the walls, or maybe something more sinister. Sophia decided to look into it more, going out on the decks at night to look for patterns and feel presences where no one else appeared to. Each hum, creak, and flash of light served as a clue to the actual haunting she had fallen into. She set out on her adventure, afraid and alone, but driven to discover what the ship had been concealing for decades. It was worse the second night. The sensation that she wasn't alone in her cabin persisted. Through the cramped corridors, every ship groan and wind whisper across the hull appeared to be exaggerated. She sat on her bed, recording on her phone, reliving the clip from the night before, and pounding her heart. The brief, hazy shapes appeared almost intentional, as though they were attempting to convey a message. Then she pushed herself out onto the balcony, with waves that glistened like liquid silver. The starry ocean seemed to go on forever. However, it seemed that the horizon was too close. Just past the rail, a shadow moved across the water in ways that the current was unable to explain. When Sophia blinked, it vanished. Her cabin was plunged into intermittent darkness as the lights inside started to flicker uncontrollably. She could hear breathing during those little blackouts, slow, deliberate, and not her own. The shadows in the corners appeared to extend out like dark smoke along the walls and floor toward her. Suddenly, there was a loud, insistent thumping from the cottage next door. Every time she moved in its direction, the sound ceased, then resumed when she moved away. There was nobody inside, so she froze, pressing her ear to the wall. No voice, no footsteps. There was only a steady scratching sound as to fingernails on wood. Could she be having the same experience as the old cruise forums she had read before making her reservation, the ones that described odd encounters and people saying they had seen passengers who had never disembarked? Sophia shut. A shadow in the corridor pulled away from the wall and assumed the form of an elderly man in a uniform. Despite the lack of features on his face, his tight posture demanded attention. Sophia knocked over her chair and staggered back inside her cabin. When she ventured to look again, the figure disappeared from the hall. Curiosity drove her on in spite of her anxiety. With a camera in hand, she started exploring the ship at night, documenting every hallway, stairwell, and vacant lounge. She saw trends, autonomously opening doors, chambers that appeared and vanished based on deck, and brief glimpses of people in antiquated cruise clothes who vanished as they were approached. Next came the fogies. She saw a reflection in a polished brass handrail in the lounge while watching tape. A young child in a sailor suit stood quietly behind her, looking straight into the camera. She turned, but there was nobody. "Don't follow us." A voice so faint it nearly mingled with the ocean breeze accompanied the chill that was creeping down her spine. Sophia understood she had a choice. Either leave, go back to the safety of ignorance, or learn more about the mysteries that had held so many people captive over the years. She was both frightened and captivated by the ship's energy and the tangible presence of the invisible. She made the decision to keep recording. The manifestations became bolder every night. Drawers opened and closed, objects moved on their own, and windows were tapped by invisible hands. The recorded sounds were subtle, nearly undetectable, yet there was a clear intelligence, a purposeful pattern in the erratic speed. Hours of footage were gathered by Sophia at the end of the week, providing proof of something genuinely supernatural. However, she was unable to rationally explain it. This ship lived between realms, a transitional space where the living and the dead met. The shadows, the murmurs, and the apparition of previous passengers all spoke to a truth she wasn't sure she wanted to confront. And Sophia was certain that the last bombshell was coming as the cruise neared its last stop. This ship wanted her to understand something. She was compelled to see what had occurred and what may occur. The next night, Sophia was more affected than ever by the ship's presence. She hadn't slept well since every groan and creak of the hull felt purposeful, like it was uttering unintelligible warnings. She gripped her camera and walked through the dark hallways, each step resonating strangely. Long shadows appeared to snake around the walls as the fluorescent lights flickered once more. She saw something chilly as she passed the dining room. The tables were set, but nobody was present. Silverware was beautifully arranged. Plates shone in the flickering light, yet there was a slight stench of rottenness in the air. This time, as if the place were stuck in an eternal past, the camera captured whispers, soft, overlapping voices talking about meals, laughs, and dispute. Sophia found the big staircase by following a trail of faint footprints, as though the one who had left them had stepped out of time itself. They were tiny, innocent, and yet incredibly old. A cool hand brushed against her shoulder as she hesitated, her hand shaking as she touched the railing. The corridor was empty as she turned around. Her heart pounded. Behind her, Sophia noticed movement in the mirrored panels that lined the walls. Men in old uniforms, women in vintage gowns, and youngsters in sailor costumes all made fleeting appearances and were always blurred as they stared at her. Their glances warned them to go now or stay forever, but no one said a word. She continued resolutely, heading for the lower decks. Here, the ship's engine buzzed more loudly, causing the metal floor to vibrate. The walls appeared to breathe, growing and shrinking as though alive, while doors opened and closed at random. In the corridor corner, her illumination saw a journal that appeared to be undamaged by the passage of time. It was bound in tattered leather. She opened it and read about disappearances, visions of passengers lost at sea, and warnings that the ship itself would select its victims in records written by a crew member decades ago. The records, which described how the ship not only crossed seas, but also navigated between realities, were hurried and scribbled in uneven scrawl. "You shouldn't be here," a voice said abruptly, echoing around the deck. Sophia turned, her illumination piercing the darkness. There was nobody. However, the temperature fell precipitously, and her breath became hazy. A chorus of whispers formed, with several voices overlapping and repeating her name while begging, cautioning, and threatening. Sophia understood that she had been marked by the ship. The shadows weren't haphazard. They were conscious, observing, testing, and anticipating her arrival. She got closer to comprehension and danger with each step she took more into the lower decks. At the end of the hallway, a dim light gleamed, her heart thumping. She walked toward it. The light emanated from a little, deserted lounge that had been beautifully furnished but had not been touched in decades. There were chairs facing inward in a circle. A lone chair rocked softly in the middle, vacant, squeaking as though someone invisible was sitting in it. She lifted her camera to record the unsettling scene. A murmur floated. "Remain here." Sophia froze. "Stay." The shadows came together to create a towering, uniformed face-obscured conductor that was pointing in her direction. She understood that the shadows were attempting to convey a secret, not to hurt her. This ship had previously experienced a devastating event that the crew had concealed. Hints of a ceremony, a tragedy, and the realization that the deceased weren't dead but rather stuck and reliving their final moments indefinitely, were all contained in the whispers. Slowly backing away, Sophia was led to the cargo hold by the whisper. The stench of seawater and iron permeated the heavy air here. Some of the crates that lined the walls were open, displaying items from long-gone passengers, such as outdated uniforms, hats, and toys for kids. Across the floor, shadows moved, creating ephemeral faces with frozen looks of fear, grief, and desperation. The ship was feeding on memories, keeping them alive in a phantom loop, and anyone who attempted to discover the truth ran the risk of joining it. She thought with a cold dread. Then, from the crates, she heard a child's laughing, followed by the icy murmur, "You can join us, forever." Sophia's hands trembled as she gripped the camera. She turned to go, backing away, but the hallway was different. She was unable to leave because doors that had before been open suddenly blocked her way. Hallways twisted strangely, and the shadows united into one shape. She understood that the ship wasn't simply haunted and that her quest was far from over. It was conscious, it was living, and now it knew she knew too. As Sophia staggered across the twisted hallway, her breath came in short spurts, as though the ship itself were alive and conscious of her panic. The walls appeared to pulse, contracting and expanding. Shadows stretched like dark fingers over the floor, clinging to her every step. She lifted her camera in the hopes that the lens would somehow explain the impossibility. But every picture was warped with people changing into agony and terror in front of her. A faint sound drew her attention. Careful, methodical footsteps reverberated behind her. She whirled around, empty. However, the lingering echo conveyed a different message. It was too purposeful and hefty to be hers alone. A wave of panic swept through. Her heart struck her ribs hard. A short stairwell leading down into the ship's bowels marked the end of the hallway ahead. The lower engine room was revealed by a faint green glow coming from below. The staff had told her not to go inside, but she had a gut feeling that the truth was waiting here. The air became heavy as they descended the steps. Something ethereal, almost pleasant but suffocating, mixed with the rust and oil. She was surrounded by whispers, louder now, overlapping. Stay. See, join, lost, never leave. Sophia gripped the railing tighter as she struggled with her increasing nausea. She froze when she arrived at the engine room. The rusted and time-frozen machinery sat still, yet the shadows moved across the walls as though they were feeding the ancient engines with memory. The ceiling was reflected by a pool of water in the middle, but the reflection was incorrect. She saw faces staring back at her crew, passengers, even herself distorted, quietly yelling. Sophia turned abruptly as one murmur pierced the air. "You shouldn't have come here." A towering figure with a uniform similar to that of the ship's captain appeared from the far side of the chamber, but his face was hidden, its features melted into the darkness. His limbs bent a little too much, and his movements were strange. The shadows rippled with every step he took, reaching for her. She came to understand that this apparition wasn't merely a ghost, but rather the ship's consciousness manifested itself. Everything she had seen was alive, even every moving shadow and whisper. It had adapted, learned, and imprisoned those who dared to discover its secrets. The exits twisted before Sophia's eyes as she attempted to escape. She had just been through corridors that now coiled back impossible. Even reality had become distorted. She was surrounded by anxious murmurs that said, "Help us, leave, become." She looked around the room frantically and noticed an old crate. Logbooks, documents, and artifacts from previous expeditions were found within the proof she required. Her hands shaking, she reached for the closest journal. Anybody who discovered the ship's terrible background, which included disappearances, mysterious deaths, and a terrifying pattern, stood the possibility of joining it and becoming stuck in spirit limbo. "You saw too much," a voice murmured right into her head. The figure moved forward, shadows twisting around her knees and extending across the floor like dark rivers. She yelled, but nothing came out. She felt as though the walls were closing in on her. She slammed the journal on the ground in despair. For a split second, the shadows flinched back. She caught sight of a partially open hatch that led to the outer deck during that fleeting moment. The smell of salt and sea was carried by the howling wind outside. Whispering secrets, vows, and threats, she ran toward it, dragging her legs through darkness that gnawed at her heels. The storm had gotten worse by the time she stepped out onto the deck. She was immediately soaked by the waves that slammed against the hull. Even though the night sky was completely dark, the ship had a faint, strangely colored glow that made it seem nearly alive and pulsed like a heartbeat. It became clear to her that the ship was more than just a ship. It was a predator, and the ocean served as its hunting field. As she took one more look at the deck, she sensed that every soul, innumerable passengers, crew members, and kids was trapped there, watching, begging, and warning her. When she whirled around, the person that had appeared behind her in the water's reflections, closer than any human should be, was gone. She recalled her camera. She held it up and took one last picture in the hopes that it would reveal to the world what the ship had been concealing for decades. However, her own face was warped. Her eyes were hollow, and the shadows of the lost danced behind her as she looked at the TV. With her muscles burning and adrenaline roaring through her veins, she ran to the lifeboat ladder. She made it to the lifeboat, despite the wind whipping about her like a furious sea god. The whispers died away as the ship sank farther into the night, leaving only the thump of her heart. Sophia made it through, but she was aware that the ship was still waiting, still alive, and still hungry, and whomever has the courage to sail close to it in the middle of the night can end up being its next star. Story 4. He wasn't moving when I first saw him, with an empty tray in his hands. He stood in the center of the large foyer and looked at me through the throng as though he already recognized me. You can call me Rachel Donovan. I'm a 33-year-old travel nurse from Oregon who often avoids extravagant vacations. However, I felt I had earned a week-long Caribbean cruise on the Elysian Dawn after 3 grueling months of working consecutive night shifts. It was meant to be enjoyable, sun-drenched, and possibly a touch careless. On that first day, the ship appeared to be running normally, with children running up the stairs to the water slides, elderly couples occupying lounge chairs, and a band playing steel drums close to the pool deck. Since it was only a cruise and a floating hotel, I recall laughing at myself for being anxious. However, I later saw him once more. They wore the same black vest and white shirt as the other servers, but something wasn't quite right. He appeared to have slept in his rumpled clothing. He had the clammy, pallid complexion that you only see when someone is ill, and he never once moved his eyes. Like a shadow that would not move, it locked on me. I told myself I was dreaming and tried to push it away. However, he was also present when I descended to the dining hall later that night, standing close to the corner where the light didn't quite reach. No one was served by him. He didn't blink at all, just watched while holding a tray. I inquired as to whether the couple at the adjacent table had seen him. After glancing over, the spouse scowled. "Who?" he inquired. The corner was deserted when I turned around. I stopped feeling like I was on vacation at that point. The faint buzz of the engines below me was like a steady heartbeat as I lay awake in my cabin that night. I told myself that I was being overly suspicious. Perhaps I had caught the man in between shifts, and he was a waiter. But I couldn't get the image off my mind. His silence, the fact that no one else appeared to notice him. I made an effort to have fun the following morning. I ordered a drink, strolled about the deck, and even participated in a trivia game at one of the clubs. It came close to working for a while. I felt like myself again till I noticed him outside the lounge's glass windows. He was out on the deck standing in the scorching sun, still holding that same tray, rather than inside with the rest of us. The peculiar thing was that his hair and clothing remained motionless, despite the wind being strong enough to send napkins flying across tables. I did a double take and looked back, but he was gone. By the third night, I was unable to persuade myself that this was merely my imagination or exhaustion. There was a problem. I even casually described him to one of the staff members. The waiter gave a courteous laugh. "Every day, ma'am, we switch shifts." I tried not to tremble when I said, "But after hours, nobody works in the uniform you described." "You mean that nobody like that works here?" He gave me a perplexed expression, as if I were kidding. When I got back to my cabin that night, I noticed a folded napkin nicely arranged on the desk. Before I opened it, I assumed it was housekeeping. "Don't eat," was scribbled in thick, sloppy writing within. I froze, the napkin shaking in my hands, and said, "He's waiting." My room was off limits to anybody else. Nevertheless, I had received that warning from someone or something. I considered filing a report, but what would I say? That a ghost waiter had been sneaking notes into my cabin since the first day. I couldn't bring myself to eat dinner. I kept looking about, trying to find something. He appeared to be absent for a while. Perhaps I had finally shook him. However, I saw him again midway through the meal, as the lights went down for the evening performance. This time, not across the room, right behind my chair, retaining the tray. Quiet, still. I remained motionless. My hand trembled as my fork paused halfway to my mouth. I was surrounded by people who were clapping and laughing at the magician who had just entered the stage. However, the thundering of my own heartbeat drowned out everything else. I glanced over my shoulder as I turned just enough. There was nobody in the chair behind me. No waiter, not a tray, only an empty seat at a packed table, with a sharp taste of metal in my tongue. I swallowed. Despite my body's cries for me to run, I made myself eat the remainder of dinner, hardly touching the food. I slid the safety chain across, secured the door, and switched on the full lights in my cabin. There was nothing for a time. I even began to believe that I was safe. Perhaps it was all stress, or perhaps my brain was creating patterns it didn't have. However, the lights began to flicker at midnight, only once, sufficient to make my stomach turn. Then, I caught a whiff. Food, savory and rich, akin to a roast being cut open. However, it was incorrect. The smell permeated my cabin like the walls themselves were leaking taste into the air. It was too powerful and metallic. A second later, there was a knock. 3 slow, thoughtful raps. I stared at the door with my back against the wall. My breath came quickly and shallowly. Under the door, the tray slid. Not a hand, not a single person. Only the tray scraped the floor until it came to a stop in the middle of the cabin. Impossible to push through the inch-high opening. A plate with a silver dome lid was on it. My whole body cried out, "Don't touch it." Nevertheless, my trembling hand moved and lifted the lid. There was no food on the dish. It contained a folded cruise manifest with a red circle around my cabin number. My stomach lurched when I saw the words, "You already ate," underneath it. My throat ached, gagging, even though I hadn't eaten anything all night. I staggered back toward the restroom. When I touched the sink, my hands trembled terribly. I spotted him when I looked up into the mirror. The server, tray balanced, standing slightly over my shoulder, staring at me through pupilless eyes. And he whispered, "Don't worry," so close I could feel his breath on my ear. "There's always space for one more." I staggered back and hit the bathroom wall with such force that the towel rack shook. But nothing. When I turned around, all I could see was my pale reflection in the mirror. The tray had vanished. No manifest. Not a silver lid. It had scraped the floor beneath the door. But there was not even a smear. The whole encounter seemed to have been lost. After that, it was impossible to sleep. Before the first rays of light peeked through the doorframe, I sat on the edge of the bed. The daytime seemed secure for a while. Footsteps reverberated throughout the corridor. People moved outdoors, and the standard ship announcements were played over the speakers. I nearly thought I had dreamed it all for the first time in days. Nearly. Desperate for normalcy, I pushed my way into the main dining area for breakfast. I continued to look at faces, check the personnel, and wait for him. However, every waiter I encountered was too human, worn out and harried. And then I saw something cold. A family of 4 was eating quietly at a table close to the corner. Complete quiet. No shifting chairs, no clinking plates, and hardly even the sound of chewing, despite the fact that their plates were heaped with unfinished food. All 4 of them were looking straight ahead with vacant eyes. The waiter was standing close behind them, somewhat in shadow. My server, the same hollow-eyed man holding a silver tray in his hands with ease. No one else took notice. Not a single person looked back. The family eventually got up and went out without saying anything, leaving their food there. The waiter disappeared into the mob behind them. That's when I noticed something terrible. There wasn't a single ghost haunting the ship, something was being fed by it. Furthermore, the waiter did more than just bring food. He was assisting travelers. I attempted to lock myself in once again that evening, checking the door and the latch twice and even shoving a chair beneath the handle. The continuous buzz of the engines kept me awake for as long as I could, but shortly after 3, I was overcome with fatigue. There was a clatter as I awoke. Someone had relocated the chair. They undid the clasp. With the moderate rocking of the ship, the door stood slightly open and swayed. I could also hear the quiet, steady roll of wheels on tile outside in the hall. A cart for serving. I stopped right in front of my cabin. A tiny, pale, and incredibly long hand slipped through the opening as the door moved open. Another inch, carefully placing something on the carpet within. A new tray. This time there was neither a manifest nor a note on it. However, I have my own passport. A black X scuffed through my photo, and a bill underneath it. 1 sol is the total paid in full. I refrained from yelling. My voice wouldn't come out. Not because I was brave. It seemed as though someone had seized my neck from the inside. My passport shone beneath that ruthless X as the platter sat there, glittering in the dim cabin light, like a receipt for something I had already paid for but hadn't consented to. The bill was clear and definite. My hands were shaking when I took it up. It felt as though it had just been penned in wet ink. I staggered back, holding on to the paper as my heart pounded so violently. I felt it may explode. But then I heard it, right outside the door. The wheels once more. Slow, steady. This time I'm moving away. I lunged to the door after waiting for the boom to subside. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed as the corridor grew empty. No cart. No waiter. The only aroma that clings to the air like perfume is that of burnt sugar. I ought to have gone back. I ought to have prayed and locked the door. But I was dragged onward by some force. Dumb, frantic curiosity. I followed the aroma, through the corridor, down a staircase, past the crew-only marked entrances. The ship seemed a little strange everywhere I looked, too quiet in the corridors. There were empty cabins that ought to have been inhabited, with luggage inside but no people. As I walked past a line of cabins, I noticed that every television was on and displaying static. No one watched them from inside. As I went down into the lower decks, the smell intensified. At last I came to an unmarked entrance. It's just steel, dented, and has a dark stain at the bottom. In my ears, my heartbeat screamed. I opened it. There was a chamber inside that was not shown on any chart of a cruise ship. No luggage, no mattresses, and no decor. There were only rows of tables arranged like a banquet hall, with heaps of unfinished food on each table, fruit plates that never browned, never cooling meat, never melting desserts. Passengers were also seated at those tables, dozens of them. They weren't eating though. They remained still. They were slouched in their chairs, looking pale with their eyes glassy and their mouths half open. Some remained motionless, clutching forks in their hands. They had untouched plates. It was as though whatever kept them alive had been sucked out of their flesh. The waiter emerged at the far end of the hall. In his palms, the silver tray shone. However, it wasn't empty this time. There was only one plate on it, a piece of cake. White icing. On top, a candle is blazing. The 3 words, "This is yours," were painted in red letters over the frosting. The flame flickered, but the air did not stir. I saw his face fully for the first time when the waiter raised his head. It wasn't even a face. With only those hollow pits for eyes and no mouth or nose, it was a blank mask of stretched, colorless flesh. After setting the plate down at the closest table, he slowly and deliberately turned to face me. When he did speak, I heard it in my mind. All ships are required to pay. All passengers are required to eat. The candle flame extinguished, and you are next. And darkness fell on the room. My first impression of the Aurora Seas was that I was just taking a luxurious cruise to escape the hustle and bustle of the mainland. This was supposed to be different. My name is Lucas Reyes, and I have traveled the world on business. Something calming, something normal, something safe. People were singing and laughing on every deck of the huge ship, which was gleaming in the port lights. I had booked a single cabin on the 9th deck, a cozy little room with a balcony overlooking the lake. As if the cabin had been waiting for me, there was a little chill in the air when I stepped inside. I threw it away as a draft and started unpacking. As the ship glided into the gentle rhythm of the evening ocean waves, the distant hum of motors seemed soothing. I was alone in my cabin with the balcony doors open and the sea wind flowing in. Just outside the cabin door at that moment, I heard a slight scratching noise. I became icy. At first, I convinced myself it was simply another traveler, a late-night stray. Maybe, but the sound continued. It went on, steady, almost deliberate. I reached for the doorknob with a trembling hand. No one was there, just the empty corridor into the darkness. I smiled uneasily at myself as I told myself that I had been traveling too much and that stress made shadows move. The scratching continued even after I locked the door and shut it. It seemed to linger in the corners of the room. The next morning I brought it up to the ship's crew. They smiled politely and shrugged. "Sir, ships are old, settling sounds." I was not reassured by their smiles. There was something about their gaze that made them appear too alert, too composed, as though they were also anticipating something. I tried to sleep that night, but the scratching came back, closer and louder. I jumped to my feet as soon as I heard the whisper, "Lucas." I was so sure that my heartbeat would reverberate throughout the cottage. I had slammed the balcony door shut, but it was open. There was an odd, metallic smell in the seaside breeze. Too terrified to breathe, I closed the door and pressed myself against it. The creaking followed. It wasn't the typical ship floor groan, but rather a purposeful sliding motion across the cabin, something invisible. Glancing across the room with my flashlight, I reached for my phone. The shadows moved strangely. The space felt alive, encroaching. I could just make out a faint human-like shape in the corner, standing motionless enough to make me wonder whether I had dreamed it. My voice trembling, I spoke into the night. "Who's there?" No answer. But the darkness was getting closer. By the time I fell asleep in fits and squalls, I knew the ship had captivated my attention in a way I couldn't explain. Aurora Seas was a living entity, not just a journey. It was watching too. I awakened up to the gentle hum of the ship's engines. But something wasn't quite right. It had been a little cold in the cabin the night before, but now it was freezing. As I rubbed my eyes and tried to shake off the unease, I tried to tell myself that the night before had been a dream or a sign of my travel fatigue. Next, I looked to the balcony. The door was open, and the drapes were fluttering violently in the breeze. I was certain that I had locked it. Panic hit me. But as I approached, I noticed footsteps, which was worse. Small, wet, dragging over the carpet toward the corner of the room. I froze, my heart thumping. No one should have been in my stateroom, much less on the 9th deck at this hour. The phone was dead when I took it up again and tried to call ship security. The deadline had passed. I gazed at my reflection in the mirror. I barely knew myself, pale, eyes wide, clutching the phone like a lifeline. The faint but distinct voice, "Lucas," returned, and I glanced around. Nothing. All that's there are shadows that twist and stretch oddly along the walls as the lights on the ceiling flicker. My mind was racing. I attempted to think of something that might be explained, like a crew member or a practical prank. But while I was thinking it, the room seemed to come to life, shivering slightly underfoot, as if the ship itself was aware of my presence. I decided to investigate. I followed the faint sound of scuffing down the hallway. The passageway curved slightly and was longer than it needed to be, as if the ship's design had changed. I stopped in front of cabin 923, the door slightly open. I couldn't recall ever seeing a cabin here empty, much less one that was reserved for someone else. I looked inside and saw a room with no furniture, walls that seemed like they had been burned, and a single rocking chair in the center that swung gently. It moved, but no one sat in it. In addition, the name Lucas Reyes was inscribed in characters on the wood. A shiver ran down my spine. My name. This has been written. Before I could make sense of anything, a shadow passed by the doorway behind me. I turned around. The hallway is empty. The lights went out though, and the whisper reappeared. This time with multiple voices overlapping. Lucas, come, sit, stay. With my heart racing, I stumbled backward and nearly fell over the balcony railing, but I dared not open it for fear that the ocean itself was watching. I ran back to my cabin and locked the door. My phone was still unusable and dead. I was imprisoned, alone. However, not alone. As the night deepened, every sound, the moan of the ship, the scratching beneath the carpet, the whispers that merged into a symphony of doom, became more and more pronounced. I realized that this was not just a haunting, it was shrewd. The ship knew me and sympathized with my fears. It was eating them too. Hours, minutes, or what? Time seemed useless. Then there was an abrupt, oppressive, complete silence. I inhaled. Then the darkness completely emerged from the corner of the room, not only a shadow but a figure, slender, abnormally tall, with arms that extended to the floor, and a face concealed. It stopped at the edge of the bed and gazed without blinking. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I made an effort to speak, but my voice was not clear. With deliberate slowness, the figure moved closer. I grabbed a jacket and hurried to the stairway, praying for light, for someone, for the main deck, as it shouted in a voice like the grinding of metal. You should have stayed ashore. The walkways were convoluted, with doors opening to infinite hallways and steps leading into an uncanny blackness. The murmurs increased in volume and pulled me toward the middle of the ship. As they sang my name, I realized then that the Aurora Seas was not a ship, but a predator. It preyed on me as well. At every turn, I twisted more than I should have as I stumbled through the hallways. The ship felt alive, its walls trembling, the flooring shifting underfoot, the lights flickering in sync with my racing heart. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I had to get out, had to escape whatever entity had taken control of this ship. The whispers increased in volume and tenacity. They were no longer just calling my name. They were taunting me. The words crept like smoke through the atmosphere and into my head and ears. Lucas, you can't leave. Stay forever. I eventually arrived at a hallway lined with cabin doors. As I passed by, the windows of each door framed my own reflection, and I noticed something disquieting in each, but they weren't just reflections. They were warped images of me. In some, my eyes bled shadows, and in others, my mouth gaped in silent screaming. I tried to turn my head away, but each door drew me in. Then, one door at the very end threw open forcefully on its own. I became icy, even though the room was dark. The faint illumination from a solitary lantern revealed a horrifying scene. Dozens of personal items, such as clothes, shoes, luggage, and watches, appeared to be carried in midair by invisible hands. They swirled slowly around the room, creating a vortex that seemed to be alive. A second figure then caught my attention. It was bigger and darker than the shadow I had previously seen. Its presence was one of pure malice. Its head tipped slightly, unnaturally, and I knew I recognized it. The word "me" wasn't crucial. A humanoid form, blank-eyed and smiling as if all the fear in the world had been sucked out. It pointed directly at me with a raised hand. The floating object sped up, spinning around like a storm. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The air grew thick, heavy, almost solid, pressing against my chest like an invisible weight. My breathing was labored. I experienced a flashback. A few weeks before to the vacation, I had read about the Aurora Seas online. Passengers going missing has been reported, videos of cabins without numbers. Some crew members denied ever seeing those decks. Then, the horrifying thought struck. What if the ship wasn't just haunted? What if it collected people, turning them into echoes and shadows of their former selves, and then surviving on their fear? The figure approached, its grin widening. "We've been waiting." I heard a murmur that was both frightening and almost sweet, and I ran. Through hallways that reverted to themselves and down stairwells that seemed to twist for no apparent reason. All of the doors I attempted were either locked or opened into the dark. I was constantly surrounded by murmurs, some originating from the front and others from the rear. After that, I reached the main dining area. There was usually laughter, music, and light. A faint, unsettling green light filled the now empty space. Chairs and tables were heaped to impossibly high levels and positioned at angles that defied physics. Shadows gathered everywhere I looked, and I saw scores of people, each a distorted representation of a previous passenger, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They both turned to look at me at the same moment. A shiver ran down my spine. They surrounded me. A staircase down to the lower decks, where the ship's engine room should have been, caught my eye. Nevertheless, a little light flared from below. I had a gut feeling that this was the only way to confront whatever was consuming the Aurora Seas. I took a big breath and started toward it. The shadows shouted, trying to pull me back. A chorus of voices mingling with the hum of the ship. However, I persisted, venturing into the unknown. I had not expected to find the engine room at the bottom. No screaming machinery, no buzzing engines. Instead, it was a huge room with mirrors all over the walls. Mirrors that reflected me instead of the room. There are thousands of me frozen in expressions of agony, despair, and fear. And it's not just me. And there, waiting in the center, smiling, was the first shadow, now complete. When the ship's voice reverberated throughout the room, "Welcome home, Lucas," to become engaged with it, I was appalled to discover that it had not only been haunting me but had also been waiting for me to arrive. I could have run deeper into the ship and risked the unknown, or I might have remained motionless and let the shadow lead me. The floor underneath me groaned and shook as though impatient. Overcoming my horror, I ran down a narrow hallway at the far end, where the mirrors mirrored everything I did. Adding to the terror, the muttering went on, but a fresh voice, a quiet, almost human voice, pierced the din. "You can resist it. Stay away from that." Was it hope, or a ruse? I had no time to reflect, knowing that whatever was waiting for me was closer than ever. I ran, plunging into the darkness and pursuing the dim light at the end of the corridor. The hallway appeared to go on forever, beyond than reason would let. My heart thumped, and my lungs burned, yet I was unable to stop. I realized that the dim light in front of me was more than simply light. It was a signal, a pulse beckoning me along. It flickered like a heartbeat. The murmurs had intensified, now blending together in a frantic symphony. Some called my name in tones that made my skin crawl, while others scolded me and pleaded with me to stay. The shadows became more daring with each step I made, scuttling over the walls like dark water, and extending their unnaturally long arms toward me. Then I was flung forward as the floor underneath me trembled fiercely. I stumbled upon a huge room that I hadn't seen on the deck drawings of the ship. High above, the roof arched, covered with weird shimmering dirt that I couldn't name, and ropes of seaweed, salt, rotting, and a metallic odor filled the air. A scene that made my stomach turn was revealed by my flashlight. Dozens of bodies, or maybe echoes of them, hung in midair, cocooned in semi-transparent shells. Mouths open in mute cries, limbs twisted, faces frozen in fear. Some were passengers I couldn't identify, and some were crew members I had previously seen. They were all frozen in a non-existent moment, staring blankly, caught between life and death. Then I saw it. The shadow, bigger than ever, standing on top of a heap of rubble, its shape changing, frighteningly solid but nearly liquid. Its face contorted my features into a smile and laughed without saying a word. It was pointing right at me, and I could feel my soul being pulled coldly in my chest. It growled, the voice resonating above all the others. "You belong here. What is owed is taken by the ship. You will join us." I shook my head and made myself run. But the room itself had changed. The walls rippled like water, the passageways twisting and repeating. Every path I took led back to this room. It seemed as though the ship had become conscious of my movements, had learned to anticipate them, and was now holding me in its nightmare heart. I needed a substitute. My gaze darted around, looking for anything that might help me gain an advantage. That's when I noticed it. A small ladder that was concealed behind a stack of containers and ascending upward. It was little, hardly roomy enough for one person, yet it led somewhere. "Do not leave. Stay. Become." I climbed, fighting to stay, as the shadows brushed past me. When I finally reached the top, I stepped out onto a deck I had never been to before, and I could hear murmurs that were now distinct phrases, like a chorus singing in unison, as my hands scraped against rotting wood and metal. Around me, the sea seems endless, black and seething, with waves crashing onto the boat. The wind ripped at my clothes, sending salty drips that burnt my eyes. It was the first time I felt free. But the shadow was there already, hovering just below the deck, its eyes glowing faintly red. It arose from the depths with an unfathomable speed. Like a predator emerging from the sea, I turned and sprinted toward the lifeboat area, my heart racing, praying that the ship's machinery was still working. I was startled to see a lifeboat ready and haphazardly fastened. When I got to the lifeboats, I didn't hesitate. I cut the rope with a broken piece of metal and climbed it. The engine came roaring to life, which surprised me. I pushed out into the black waves, leaving the Aurora seas behind. But as I drifted away, the ship did not fade. It grew. Shadows rose from its deck like tentacles, reaching for the lake. For me, I thought, "You can't escape," as the whispers became an overwhelming noise. Then silence fell as suddenly as it had begun. When the ship vanished over the horizon, there were only black waves left. I thought I was alone myself. I noticed a tiny ripple on the water's surface out of the corner of my eye. The ship's outline was reflected in a shadow that stretched across the oceans. It was still there. It waited. Waiting never stops. As I paddled toward a distant light on the horizon, I assured myself I had survived. However, I had a gut feeling that this was only a temporary circumstance. Aurora's waters never forgot. It was not tolerant. It merely waited for its next victim. Somewhere, deep in the darkness, I saw my own reflection grinning back at me, reminding me that a part of me had been left behind, forever connected to the ship's never-ending nightmare. Story 6. The ship creaked when I woke up, as if it were trying to warn me in a whisper that I couldn't quite hear. The smell of disinfectant and salt permeated the passageways, but underneath it was a harsh, cold, metallic tang that wasn't there. Ethan Riley is my name. I'm a 29-year-old Portland, Oregon-based IT consultant. I've devoted the majority of my life to solving issues for other people, looking at screens and persuading myself that I enjoyed routine. I wanted a holiday, but I needed a location where the world was limited and I could pretend that everything outside the ship didn't exist after my younger sister passed away unexpectedly last year. A cruise sounded ideal, somewhere the horizon was inaccessible, where the incessant buzz of the water may blot out the memories that tormented me. I was cautious and timid, but I was longing for something that would seem like a new beginning. I had no idea how enormous the Ocean Sovereign cruise ship would be. Its balconies were piled like cards in a huge shining tower, and its decks ascended in a sweeping curve, white against the early morning sky. Under me, the engine rumbled steadily, almost reassuringly, and announcements over the tannoy floated down the hallways. A quiet, well-practiced human voice drowning out the thunder of the ocean. Greetings from the Ocean Sovereign. The word safe reverberated strangely in my chest as we wished you a pleasant and safe travel. I was given cabin 7118 on deck 7, midship, with a little balcony facing nothing but the undulating waves. The room had a subtle scent of polish and sea air. Soap bars were placed with care, and towels were folded like swans. I carefully unloaded, following the floor and ceiling patterns, noticing the small flaws that seemed oddly intentional, like a scratch in the wood trim or a scuff on the railing. The first abnormalities began by the second night. Somewhere in the hull, right under my bed, there was a weak, sporadic tapping to start. 3 slow taps. A pause. 2 short ones. I convinced myself it was the metal expanding and compressing, the ship settling. But when I exited the room, the taps echoed behind the doors of empty cabins and followed me down the corridor. Every time I turned, the dim figure that had been at the corner of my eye vanished. The other travelers appeared blissfully oblivious. Children ran along the promenade deck, clattering against the railings, while couples laughed on balconies. The personnel never stopped moving, directing, smiling, folding towels, and moving like cogs in a well-oiled machine. Every instinct told me otherwise, but I wanted to think it was all in my imagination, a mix of loneliness and loss. The ship's rhythm started to feel strange on the 3rd day. Announcements were occasionally repeated in an odd order, or were somewhat delayed. In the hallways where no one was walking, lights flickered. The cabin then arrived. I got a glimpse of cabin 402, which was hidden in a less visited area of deck 4, through a crack in the service door. The interior was eerily immaculate and untouched, but a shadow moved inside just enough to imply a presence that shouldn't have been there. Cabin 402 had been sealed off by maintenance weeks earlier. I once watched the ocean become dark under the stars while I sat in the aft lounge one evening. An elderly man who had last been saw close to the pool was reported missing by a local family. Although the crew conducted a thorough search, their cool professionalism seemed strange, as if they were concealing something more serious than simple errors in procedure. Later at the buffet, I ran across Mara, a young woman. She had a notepad full with diagrams, scrawls, and little drawings of doors and corridor. She muttered about weird reflections in the mirrors, whispers, and how crew members would occasionally enter spaces just to disappear behind previously undiscovered doors. Her statements, which mirrored my own mounting uneasiness, were desperate yet credible. She made a hesitant joke. If you're listening to this, take a second to subscribe to Untold Happenings. It helps keep stories like this alive. But the comedy was lost in the anxiety in her eyes. That evening, the tapping came back at its exact time, now distinctly 2 quick, 3 leisurely. A pause. I placed my ear to the balcony door. The ocean was a huge black mirror, serene and unconcerned. The hollow echo beneath the deck plates was the only sound. Shadows appeared to bend and lean as I peered into the passage, testing me as though the ship itself were living. I started noticing little omissions. Crew members I had previously met failed to show up at their regular station. Some of the doors I had passed several times were either locked or completely gone. The ship's layout changed each time I thought I grasped it. It seemed to me that the Ocean Sovereign had a purpose of its own that I was not yet permitted to comprehend. The atmosphere increased on day 4. At erratic intervals, a faint humming beneath the flooring pulsed, occasionally matching the tapping. Outside my cabin, I could hear footsteps pacing at night, but they would disappear when I tried to hear them. Figures that were not there were mirrored by mirrors, and the reflections lasted for much too long before vanishing. Shadows extended and drew toward me as even the lights on the balcony appeared to flicker in acknowledgement. Most of the other passengers shook their heads or laughed when I tried to relay my experiences. Some of the crew gave hazy answers, such as "ships have memories," "metal resonates," and "old vessels act strangely at sea." However, their eyes showed a sort of resigned understanding, and their explanations were weak. They had knowledge that I did not. The problem with the missing passenger worsened on the evening of the 5th day. An additional visitor, a man in his 50s, did not come back from the upper deck. Staff conducted a ceaseless search, but it appeared pointless at every turn. A faint pattern in the floors ran from the aft lounge down to a restricted service hatch on deck 4, and I felt forced to follow. Following the ship's hidden passages and service facilities, the tapping increased in volume and intensity, nearly leading me in its direction. I knelt in front of the hatch and listened to the steady beat inside the steel below. I opened it gently, my heart pounding, and saw a stairway leading down into the shadows. The aroma I had first detected was present in the thick, metallic air that rose, along with a harsh, cold tang and something more underneath. Remorse. Perhaps. My weight made the steps creak, every sound, including the engine's rumble and the ventilation system's hum and the far-off giggles of the passengers above, seemed to be amplified and blended into a discordant symphony. Then, I noticed it. A human-shaped shadow that moved silently along the service corridor's far wall but was incredibly lengthy. I went cold. The tapping ceased. The quiet weighed more than the sea and steel surrounding us. My logical mind cried out for explanations, such as maintenance lights, eye tricks, or stress. But I felt deep down that the Ocean Sovereign was no typical ship. Then, almost whispering, it touched the back of my neck and said, "Don't follow." I wanted to run, to go up the stairs, to go to the wide decks and the uncaring waters. However, there was something that anchored me to that dim hallway, something patient, intentional, and waiting. For the first time, I felt like just another note in the ship's eerie music, which had chosen its own beat. Now the Ocean Sovereign was more than a vessel. It was a vessel with memory and purpose, a cage, and I was only starting to realize how profoundly it may affect a traveler. As I made my way deeper into the ship's interior, the stairway creaked beneath my weight. The slender service hallway beneath Deck 4 was dimly lit by the flickering lights above. Here, the hum of the engines was more intense, almost deafening, and it vibrated through my chest in a pattern that matched my heartbeat. I entered a maze of pipes, storage spaces, and maintenance closets that smelled of iron, oil, and something else I couldn't identify with each step. A world the passengers above didn't even know existed. The beam of my flashlight shook in my hand as I held it close. Even though the shadow I had seen before was no longer there, I could still feel it, a chilly awareness that seemed to follow me with every cautious step. The faint scraping that reverberated somewhere below the bulkheads had completely replaced the tapping. I wasn't dreaming. Unless someone or anything is moving, there are no noises like these in empty hallways. As I pushed one of the double doors open, the hinges moaned like a sigh, and I saw a small chamber with faint red emergency light. The doors were made of industrial steel, painted a dull gray, and had a little scratched sign that stated "Crew Only." I spotted crew members' personal belongings, including jackets, shoes, and a single picture of a happy family. Inside lockers that lined the walls, some of which were open and some of which were dented. However, the final locker in the row was unique. A set of vacant eyes stared out at me as the door swung gently, or so it appeared. When I blinked, the locker was vacant. There was only the slightest hint of ice and metal. Above, the ship was pulsing with its own beat. The occasional announcement filtered down through shafts and vents, along with muffled laughter and distant music from the promenade deck. There was only the sound of flowing water, the tremor of steel, and the knowledge that I was being watched down here in the depths of the Ocean Sovereign. I continued, making my way along a mental map made from the odd drawings Mara had shown me. "The ship has corridors that shouldn't exist," she had warned me. "They change. Doors come and go, and occasionally, it keeps people." I attempted to chuckle at the idea, but my voice broke in the deserted hallway. I discovered a hatch at the end of a small tunnel that I hadn't noticed on the ship's drawings. It was open a little, and a cold air rushed out of it. I squatted down and looked inside, aiming my spotlight down. A spiral staircase with condensation-slick walls led down into the blackness. Then I heard it, a low, muted, distant, yet insistent whisper, almost like someone calling a name. Maybe it was just my imagination. However, it had a familiar tone. I started down, driven by a combination of fear and obstinate curiosity. The first night I had sensed a metallic tang in the air, and it became heavier and colder. The scratching was back, louder, more regular, and almost impatient now. As I went down, the ship moaned and creaked all around me, and the stairs seemed to get narrower. My flashlight's shaky beam was all I had left when the overhead light faded, and I was engulfed in darkness. I went into a tiny room at the bottom. Water dripped down the metal floor from pipes that wound along the walls, and a hut in the middle, nor mentioned anywhere in the ship's archives, and nor on any deck plans. One polished, attractive door that looked as though it belonged on the promenade deck rather than in this maintenance level. I paused, reaching for the doorknob with a shaking hand. Silently, the door opened to reveal a seemingly ordinary room with a little writing desk, a bed that was made up, and the curtains drawn. Then I noticed the journal on the desk, with a page written in a hand I recognized. It was written by Mara. "Don't follow. They observe. The ship recalls," even though the door behind me had just been open a few seconds earlier. A chilly wind blasted across the room. "If you are here, you will not leave." A figure was standing just beyond the edge of the light, and I noticed movement in the corner of my eye as the floorboards groaned. It was tall and slender, its features hidden by shadow, and its head cocked as though it were studying me. I blinked. It had vanished. Something forced me to move forward even though my sensible thinking begged me to stop. The pages of the journal turned quickly, as though they were trapped in an invisible draft. A list of names appeared on another page. Travelers, crew, dates of disappearance. A few were removed by scratching. Others walked about. My chest was thumping with my heart. Freshly circled at the bottom was Mara's name. Behind me, a loud clang reverberated across the hallway. With my flashlight shaking, I spun around, but there was nothing. I was interrupted when the door to the enigmatic cabin banged shut. At the boundaries of the light, shadows gathered and began to stretch, twist, and move on their own. The handle was locked when I tried it. I put my ear to the door and listened to the faint hum of the engine, the tap of water trickling somewhere, and beneath it all, breathing. The words returned, low and relentless, and came from the walls themselves. "Leave, or stay, forever." Slow, methodical, directly behind me. I turned around. The corridor is empty. However, I could see my breath hanging in the air, and the temperature had fallen. The scratching had intensified, reverberating about me in all directions. At that moment, I became aware that the ship's passageways were changing once more. Walls and doors were shifting and twisting, making places where none should be. The layout no longer matched my memories, the maps or the designs. I pushed back against the wall and fumbled for my phone, but all I could find was the flashlight's dim glow. No signal, no connection. A shadow glided toward me across the distant wall more quickly than any person should be able to. My legs wanted to run, my stomach sank, and my chest constricted, yet the hallway seemed to go on forever. I became aware that the spacecraft was conscious and living, and that I was intruding on its memory when I heard a faint, derisive laugh reverberating through the metal walls. On the desk behind the locked door, the diary was open, pages fluttering as though it were alive. I bolted when I noticed Mara's reflection in the tiny wall mirror standing behind me with hollow eyes and muttering, "They take the curious first." The staircases were long, the corridors winding. There were hallways, locked doors, and murmurs everywhere you looked. The only constant is the continuous hum of the engines, which is the ship's heartbeat and mine, both of which are synchronized in fear. I came to the realization that nobody on board, not even the passengers or crew, really knew what the Ocean Sovereign was. Additionally, I was discovering the truth too late. It took away my life, curiosity, and attention, and I heard the tapping again, impatient, slow, and deliberate. In the farthest shadowy corner of the maintenance deck, they were counting in my direction. The ship folded around me like a living puzzle as I rushed through those winding hallways for an unknown amount of time. Every move appeared both familiar and incorrect at the same time, with corridors reaching unthinkable lengths and doors appearing where none had previously existed. My lungs were screaming for breath that felt thicker than water, and my chest was burning. I was unable to break free from the beat of the tapping that came next, reverberating from every wall, ceiling, and floor. At a junction, I pushed against the chilly metal wall and forced myself to stop in order to collect my breath. At that moment, I realized that the lights above were not merely flickering. Rather, they were gradually decreasing in a pattern akin to eyes narrowing toward me. Unnaturally, shadows gathered and stretched over the hall, writhing and twisting in ways that were not imaginable in the realm of ordinary physics. It was followed by a harsher metallic taste that I had been noticing since the first night, along with a fouler stench that smelt like old blood or decaying wood. Despite my queasy stomach, I continued because I was curious, or perhaps because I was crazy. I had to figure out how to get out, or at least comprehend what was going on. I eventually found the service hatch that I had initially observed, which led to the spiral stairway that led to the secret passageways of Deck 4. I was positive that I had closed the door, but it was open. The tiny whispers I had started to associate with the ship itself were carried by a frigid draft that hissed out. I paused, then went down. The corridor at the bottom was too long. Ahead, I could make out dim lights and the glow of a second door, the same design as the enigmatic cabin I had previously found. I walked carefully up. There was a small crack in the door. I could see the journal on the desk, the curtains drawn, the bed set just right. However, something fresh was present. Small, damp footprints that led to the room's corner. I didn't breathe. I spun around when I heard a faint stir behind me. The corridor is deserted. The only sound coming through the metal was the slight buzz of the motor. The tapping was back, this time quick, irregular, eager, and reverberated through the walls like a countdown. My heart struck my ribs hard. I have to be aware. I pushed the door all the way open. Aside from the mirror on the far wall, the interior of the room appeared typical, even unremarkable. Then she appeared. Mara, or someone like her. Her mouth moved and her eyes drooped, but she made no sound. She twisted her head as I moved closer, her reflection contorting strangely and grinning with a grin that made my skin crawl. The lights then went off. Complete darkness. I saw my flashlight flicker violently and then die. It was like the ship itself was breathing around me as the hum of the engines grew louder and more alive. I heard footsteps, but they weren't mine, pacing the hallway outside the cabin slowly and deliberately. I was in a panic. I screamed for anyone or anything and hammered on the walls, but the metal seemed to drown out my voice. I scrambled in my pockets for my phone as the murmurs returned. Stronger this time, and contained instructions rather than just warnings. Stay, stay, stay. No signal, no illumination. My trembling hands were the only ones experiencing the chilly metal of the walls. The tapping then ceased. Quietness, more dense than anything I had ever encountered. I listened and froze, and I became aware that I was not the only person in the room. From the far corner came a tall, blurry, almost flowing shadow. Its eyes were on me, piercing my thoughts. I tripped on something squishy and staggered back. A corpse. I felt a knot in my stomach. When I turned and scurried up, I saw the shadow grow longer and sweep across the room in my direction. The frigid air pressed against my lungs and filled me with a fear I had never experienced before. I took off running, through the winding hallways, down passageways that were not marked on any map. Exits I had just passed were blocked by doors that shut behind me. There were more shadows, more rumors, and more proof that the Ocean Sovereign was more than just a ship. Rather, it was a predator that was conscious and alive. I ended up in the lounge at the back. The shadows moved strangely even here, where they should have been known and safe. I heard muted, unidentifiable cries in the distance. Above me, a maintenance hatch opened, revealing a crew member who was stood motionless, and had wide, empty eyes. I kept thinking about the names of the missing passengers. It dawned on me then that they hadn't just disappeared. They were taken by the ship. It required curiosity, apprehension, and attentiveness, and now it was aiming toward me. Desperate for any way out, I continued and staggered into a hallway I didn't know. The smooth walls pulsed softly, like though they were breathing. Subsequently, I noticed a cabin number, 708, flashing dimly under the weak, red light. My cabin. It wasn't my cabin though. The layout and balcony borders were familiar to me, but everything was off. The furniture had moved a little. The angles were off, and the shadows were shifting on their own. I opened the door with a push. The balcony doors were wide open, bouncing slightly with the waves, and the bed was vacant within. However, a little, deformed creature squatted in the corner. It wasn't me or Mara, but rather a once human entity. The red emergency light was mirrored in its eyes, which were aware, accusing and hollow. I pulled back. By itself, the door slammed behind me. The hallway had moved once more. In my chest, I could hear the tapping, which was now all over the place. Counting, counting, counting. I realized then that the ship didn't simply take people. It ensnared their focus, their anxiety and their essence. And it wanted you more, the more you tried to get away. Shadows stretched, whispers screamed in my ears, and the hallways folded in on themselves as I fled blindly. The ocean raged somewhere above, unconcerned. But the ship was patient, and I was completely alone, down here. As I turned yet another impossible curve, I came to the realization that I would not be leaving this place as I had entered it. I had been claimed by the ocean sovereign. Even worse, I was starting to realize how much the claim cost. I had no idea how long I had been running or whether time still existed in this place. The hallways had entirely changed. The steel walls now appeared to be breathing, growing and shrinking with every heartbeat. Every door I went through opened up a new impossibility, a cabin that shouldn't be there, or a hallway that curved back on itself. The ocean sovereign has no intention of allowing me to depart. I knew with a terrible clarity. The tapping had slowed, now measured and purposeful. They were counting in my direction. My hands were raw from banging on doors, attempting to find a way out, but the ship seemed to anticipate every action. The whispers had become louder, broken and overlapping in a chorus of orders, threats and pleas. Stay forever. Listen. Follow. Then I heard a quiet but distinct voice. Mara, or what Mara had been. From someplace above, down, and all around me at once. She said, "Ethan, they know you're here. Don't listen." Her voice was fearful and panicked, but it also had an uncanny calm, as if she had come to terms with her fate. I ended up staring out over the whole ocean, from a balcony I had never seen before. The black river reflected the stars in the endless night sky. The horizon, however, was incorrect. It was unending, uninterrupted, and consisted just of water and darkness, with no land or other ships. The waves shifted strangely, bending and curling as if the ship were agitating them. Behind me, the balcony door crashed. I turned, but the aft deck's bleak, unachievable emptiness had taken the place of the tunnel I had been traveling. Long, slender, unnaturally humanoid shadows moved along the railings. Instead of walking, they glided, their shapes blending at the edges as they hovered just above the deck. One came to a halt and faced me. Its awareness was palpable in the way it watched, measured, and waited. Voices from everywhere and nowhere, layered over each other as the muttering intensified into a cacophony. Then I understood that every action I had performed and every door I had opened had fueled the ship. Curiosity. Curiosity. The ship was made of more than simply wood and metal. It was hunger, alertness, and intent. It also consumed living things. I rushed toward a lifeboat station at the extreme edge of the deck, out of desperation. The lifeboats were dangling, their cables taut, motionless. The closest rope burnt my palms as I grasped it. The rope went slack after twisting violently. I staggered back. The darkness was drawing near. Then I caught sight of the passengers who had gone missing. Not entirely alive, but not. They stood along the railings, staring into the water with wide eyes and blank faces. Some held their palms up to me in inviting, not warning. Despite my need to scream, grab out, and yank them away, my legs would not cooperate. The glass of the balcony doors reflected me, with pale skin and empty eyes, and behind me, shadows forming shapes I couldn't identify. The entire deck trembled as a deep rumble that was more powerful than the ship's engines. The darkness lunged. Blindly, I slid down the short spiral staircase into darkness and dove into a maintenance hatch. Then came the intense, terrified, living whispers. "Stay, forever. Join us." I turned to run, but the exit had disappeared. At the bottom, I staggered into a room full of mirrors. Hundreds of them, each showing a different image of me that moved on its own, each one mouthing the words I couldn't hear. My chest echoed with the steady, purposeful tapping that came back, counting once more. Then I saw her, or the shell of her. "Mara," I heard her say. "It's too late, Ethan," as she moved forward from one of the mirrors, her eyes vacant. "It now recognizes you." I attempted to run, but the ground moved under me. The walls folded inward in an impossible twist. Mirror after mirror converged on me, reflection upon reflection. The engine's hum and my own thoughts were drowned by the roaring whispers. I thought I heard a passenger laugh up above, a faint, distant announcement I recognized. However, it was out of place in the world I was in. The ship had changed from what it had been. The ocean sovereign had come to light as a living, breathing trap, a predator, and a memory. Desperate, I put my palms against a mirror, and the image looked back. First, my reflection shifted, and then the mirror broke, splintering my image into sharp pieces. Every piece muttered, begged, and accused. The shadows then arose from the glass, encircling me, squeezing, directing, asserting. The tapping is the last thing I recall before the cold engulfed me. A pause, 2 quick, 3 leisurely, and then silence. I was back in my cabin when I woke up, or a variation on it. The balcony doors are open, the bed is clean, and the ocean is serene. I made an attempt to go. All the hallways brought me back here. Mara had left. The murmurs had vanished, for the time being. But I still dream about the tapping. The ship recalls, and I am aware that it is still out there, patiently waiting and counting while I write this. And it only takes a heartbeat to claim any curious passenger. I'm not sure if I will ever go. Its own is not released by the ocean sovereign. Curiosity is the coin this ship requires, and I wonder if anyone else is listening to this story at night and if you will comprehend the warning. Furthermore, the horizon is infinite. Days or even hours, I couldn't tell anymore, went by in the never-ending cycle of hallways and mirrors. The ship curved about me, with doors leading back to cabins I had previously evacuated and passageways that went on forever. Every time I tried to get away, I ended up back on the same balcony, facing the same incredibly serene ocean. A constant reminder that the ship was conscious, patient, and alive was the hum of the engines, which beat in rhythm with my heartbeat. I made my way through an unfamiliar labyrinth of maintenance halls. Just beyond my line of sight, shadows darted around the walls, muttering my name and taunting my panic. I saw glimmers of the missing people, some leaning against walls, some looking around corners, their faces and eyes vacant, all still like statues in a pitch-black gallery. They were also imprisoned, now a part of the ship, their dread ingrained in its memory, their attention fueling it. I spun when I heard a faint creak behind me. Nobody. However, the murmuring came back, louder now, a chorus of voices that appeared to emanate from every surface and mirror saying, "You belong here. Stay with us, forever." I screamed till my throat burned, but my voice simply reverberated back at me, distorted. I discovered another enigmatic cabin that I had never seen before. Its door was ajar just enough to let in warm, inviting light that contrasted with the chilly metal of the hallways. I was drawn in by desperation. The interior of the room was immaculate, almost unbelievable, and equipped like a luxury suite. And there was Mara, a familiar figure crouching on the bed, still alive, or a recollection. I was unable to tell. She turned slowly, her eyes hollow, but she urgently and softly whispered my name. I froze and said, "Ethan, don't look behind you." The darkness had deepened, gathering at the room's edges and extending in my direction. Overlapping her remarks, the muttering grew louder. My headlamp clattered to the ground as I staggered back, saying, "Joined, stay, feed." The shadows rushed forward, but rather than hit, they drew back, drawing toward the balcony doors that suddenly led to an impossibly shimmering ocean. The waves were unreasonably high, creating countless mirrors that reflected the night sky. The horizon was no longer real. I realized with a breath-stealing terror, the ship had made it. Impossible and infinite, a prison masquerading as freedom. With a quivering voice, Mara took a step closer. "Ethan, the ship remembers everything. Every stride you take, every passenger, every fear." I tried to ask why, but the words died in my throat. "Once it notices you, it doesn't let go. Curiosity is payment," came a deep, resonant whisper from the shadows. Fear is a source of nourishment. The air was filled with a metallic tang I had come to fear, and the shadows pulsed, moving as one, like river flowing. Attention is life. Leaping into the never-ending night, I dashed to the balcony doors. Whispers and tapping were carried by the chilly, piercing wind that struck me. I ended up back on the balcony of cabin 70118. After falling into the ocean, I could hear the soft, measured tapping from under the deck, but the ocean below was still and uninterested. They were counting. Never stop counting. I tried every door while I screamed and banged on them. I found my way back here via every hallway, hatch and stairwell. The ocean sovereign didn't move, and I grasped at the truth when I heard the tiniest echo of Mara's warning in my head. They take the curious first. It failed to sail. It ran in a circle, a living thing fed by the dread and fascination of its occupants. The sea did not lose the missing. Now they were a part of the ship stuck in the interminable hallways. Shadows stretched thin, waiting to be claimed by the next heartbeat. Then came me. The purpose of this post is to alert anyone considering boarding a ship such as the Ocean Sovereign. The ship never forgets. The mirrors lie. The corridors twist. Please take a moment to subscribe to Untold Happenings if you're listening to this. It helps preserve stories like this. But watch out. The Ocean Sovereign always collects, and curiosity has a price. I occasionally hear the tapping reverberating through the hull in the dead of night. 3 slow, a pause, 2 rapid, and I am aware that the horizon is limitless, and the ship is patient, regardless of how far I go or how long I live. Your turn is the final sound I hear before going to sleep, assuming sleep is still real, and it chills me more than any ocean breeze. Story 7. Why is this hallway empty? As my footsteps reverberated off the metal walls, I muttered to myself. The subtle smell of salt and engine oil lingered in the air as the Ocean Sovereign moaned all about me. A low hum pulsing through my chest. There was something wrong with the silence. It was too absolute. I had taken this cruise in order to get away from the oppressive monotony of Boston life. Evan Miller, a 32-year-old history teacher who is divorced, is attempting to move past my father's unexpected passing. Even though I wasn't the adventurous kind, I needed a week of peace and quiet and normalcy, or so I believed. The first day went without incident. The ship's public address system played happy announcements. Laughter floated across the deck and the pool deck smelt like chlorine and sunscreen. But by nightfall something changed. Numbers were twisted, doors appeared where none should be, and the passageways lost their meaning. My stateroom 312 took me to a tiny office called Captain Lorigan, which had a metal nameplate I didn't know. Papers were strewn on a desk inside, some pristine and newly typed, some yellowed. There was an open logbook with pages written in handwriting I didn't recognize, but at the bottom of one page was a note that said, "Passenger Miller," written in crimson ink. "Looks too intently. It needs to be directed. The vessel is fed by observation." My heart rate increased. That wasn't what I had written. I was startled by a knock at the door. A crew member inquired if everything was okay while wearing a courteous smile. I brought up the ostensibly closed Deck 9. His grin got bigger. "For your protection, sir. It's best not to roam." Nevertheless, his footsteps dragged strangely, warped and metallic, as he left. The intercom back in my cabin crackled. My name was repeated in layered whispers beneath the captain's voice, which also announced dinner, the weather and other unimportant information. "Don't rely on your eyes. Observe. You belong here now." My phone buzzed with a message I didn't send, and I made myself go to sleep even though the cabin felt smaller, the walls moving slightly, the shadows gathering in corners. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the office once more, along with my elderly self, who was hollow-eyed and constantly writing in the captain's log. My voice was added to the growing volume of the whispers. "Observation never ends. Don't go." I tried normalcy the following morning. Breakfast, banter, but I was duped by the lounge. Passengers were silently staring at me, plates frozen in midair. I blinked. One raised a glass in a silent toast, and the room became silent. All that was left was the soft hum of engine. By evening, the hallways had become even more convoluted. Doors had opened to new offices, and every reflection revealed an older, hollow-eyed person observing instead of me. I came to see that the ship captured curiosity and attention in addition to bodies, and I had already caught its attention. By mid-morning, the ocean sovereign had taken on the feel of a living maze rather than a ship. Each hallway I passed felt a little different from the one before. I had turned corners securely, but suddenly they curved impossibly, and the numbers on the doors changed. My footsteps reverberated, but occasionally a second echo trailed behind me, as if someone or something was following me slowly. In the hopes of seeing a typical scenario, I made the decision to check the lounge. The aroma of bread and coffee ought to have been calming. Rather, the space was eerily quiet. As if frozen mid-breath, steam emerged from half-full mugs. Plates were strewn, chairs overturned. I halted, my heart pounding, and realized that I was all alone. But I also felt like I was being watched from every angle. Then I saw the travelers. They shifted erratically, like the skipping of old film reels. Families, couples, and even people I faintly remembered from previous travels were staring right at me. Silently, their jaws opened and closed. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. In what appeared to be a wave, one old man raised a hand, but his gaze never left mine. A woman wearing a steward's uniform showed up with a clipboard in her hand. "The captain has asked you to come into the office, sir." Immediate. Her voice was devoid of urgency, but it was filled with an unnatural certainty that gave me no other option. The hallways twisted as I followed her. A tiny stairwell was formed by a wall that should have led to deck 5. As I went by, the handrails grew and contracted. By the time I got to a window, fog was curling over the terrace. Passenger shapes appeared out of the fog, their faces expressionless, moving as though pulled by unseen thread. I could see they were waiting inside the fog, as their palms pressed against the glass. I wandered into a tiny office that wasn't supposed to be there. There were papers all over the place, some new, others decades old. There was an open logbook with my handwriting detailing things I hadn't seen. "Passenger Miller. Observation critical," said a crimson note. "Don't go." Through the buzz of the engines, the faint whispers began. "The ship sees all." They became louder, overlapping, and indistinct from my own thoughts. As I said, "Observe, do not leave. Witness." I was now bound to the ship by my curiosity, which had always been my strongest suit. I attempted to capture the irregularities on my mobile device. Mid-recording, the files became corrupt. The screen was loaded with glitches that multiplied faces in ways that were impossible. An older, hollow-eyed version of myself was reflected in a mirror in the corner. Writing incessantly, I spun as I heard a knock behind me. Nothing. The only thing that swayed was a coat rack. With purpose, the fog moved beneath the door. The ship reshaped offices, lounges, and hallways to keep me from paying attention, making me feel confined. A brief notion crossed my mind. Perhaps I could get away if I left. I made my way to a stairwell I was familiar with, but when I got there, the stairs went on forever, the metal railings changing as I touched them. I felt a wave of panic as I understood that the ship had distorted perception in addition to disorienting bodies, and I believed I heard my own voice murmuring, "Observation is eternal." Somewhere in the midst of the mechanical hum, "You remain." The stairwell shouldn't have been this long. As if alive, the handrails were warm at first, then frigid, and each step appeared to lengthen beneath my feet, just beyond my field of vision. Shadows shifted in ways that were impossible for humans to perform. My pulse pounded as I sprinted, but the hallway behind me changed into something I couldn't have imagined. I reached a massive, unmarked brass door. There was a lounge inside, but it was stuck in time. Passengers mid-bite, a pianist mid-strike, laughs in mid-air. Everyone turned to face me. Not strangers, but the faces of loved ones, friends and brief acquaintances staring blankly. Silently, Mouths moved, echoing the whispers I had heard. Look, remain. I attempted to retreat, but the stairs behind me was no longer there. There was nothing left save a maintenance hallway with walls lined with containers and pipes, bustling with activity. I stumbled over a loose container as I rushed. There was a clang of metal. I went cold. A tall, faceless creature reached out to me in the darkness. Underfoot, the floor sagged and stretched. Desperation drove me to wrench open a hatch that read "Emergency Egress. Authorized personnel only." I went down into a shaft of darkness, thick humidity with a rusty, briny sea scent. I heard faint footsteps above, constantly just behind, but the ceiling vanished into thin air when I looked up. A storage bay created a labyrinth at the bottom. Silently, humanoid but impossibly twisted shapes crawled down the racks. The tunnel seemed to double, with corridors overlapping every time I attempted to turn. I have to get out, my logical mind cried. At last, there was a door marked Deck 1, Emergency Egress, and light poured out of it. The stars shone. Below, waves crashed weakly. There was a wave of relief. I ran. However, the floor fell, extending underneath me. The lifeboat I had seen twisted into a long corridor. The stars disappeared. Behind me, the hatch banged. The fact that the ocean sovereign didn't kill struck me like cold. It took up memory, focus, and perception. Every observation and escape attempt fueled the ship and contributed to its design. "Observation is everything," said the whispers, mixed with a mechanical hum. "You're here to observe." I slowed, panting. The hallways were continuously layered on top of one another. Unaware, passengers came in far-off corridors laughing and conversing. There was a creak of a door. One of the reflections winked. Would I ever leave? I wondered. Or was I now a part of the ship? Always watching, always conscious, always powerless. Now, every hallway seemed to be alive and breathing all around me. With every stride, the walls grew and shrank, and the lights flickered erratically. A dining hall was suspended in silence as I turned a corner. With dishes in mid-air, passengers stuck in laughter, and heads turning in perfect synchronization toward me. My chest constricted. They weren't frozen. They waited. I attempted to move, but the floor under me appeared to drag me along. With hallways stretching on forever, my mind cried out to go, to find an escape, to recall who I was. But the ship was changing my perception as the murmurs became louder and were laced with my own voice. Observe, do not leave, witness forever. Dimly lighted, a hatch emerged, offering freedom, fresh air, and lifeboats. Above, stars flashed dimly. With my pulse pounding, I ran and grabbed for the ladder. There was a wave of relief. Then the hatch dissolved into a tunnel. The floor expanded, and the stars disappeared. There was no escape from the ship. Polished railings glistened with reflections. Older, hollow-eyed, and writing endlessly in a captain's log. I couldn't recall writing. My own face gazed back. Humanoid but twisted shapes crept along walls and ceilings, stealthily imitating my movements. My curiosity, the same quality that brought me here, kept me going even if panic threatened to overwhelm me. Again, I located the captain's office. The log opened to a blank page, papers all over the place. Unintentionally, my hand moved and scratched lines I didn't mean to. Words made by crimson ink echoed the murmurs. Observation is eternal. The vessel is fueled by curiosity. You stay. When I realized the ship did more than just trap bodies, I staggered backward, my heart racing and my breath ragged. It imprisoned perception, consciousness, and focus. Every time I tried to flee, I was drawn further into its hallways and integrated into its architecture. Faint laughing resounded somewhere in the distance, a reminder of new, uninformed travelers coming in for the same destiny. The hallways grew in number as I moved on, stacking one after the other as the fog rolled in like a tide. Inseparable from the ship, my own murmurs joined the chorus. At that moment, I realized that escape was a myth. The ocean sovereign encompassed every corridor, door, every darkness. I was suddenly a spectator, imprisoned, a vessel of my own interest, permanently enshrined in the ship's memory. For the final time, the lights flickered. A door creaked open somewhere in the interminable halls. I believed I saw a lifeboat waiting, a slice of sky and freedom. Then, more loudly than before, the murmurs surrounding me. Observation is eternal. You stay. I continued. The ship then let out a breath.